Chapter 5. The Man Who Saw God. Winter had come to the Bay of Biscay. With the passing of the equinox, the gales began to increase in violence, adding infinitely to the labours and dangers of the British Navy watching over the coast of France. Easterly gales, bitter cold, which the storm-tossed ships had to endure as best they could, when the spray froze on the rigging and the labouring hulls leaked like baskets. Westerly gales, when the ships had to claw their way safely from a lee shore and make a risky compromise between gaining sufficient sea room and maintaining a position from which they could pounce on any French vessel venturing out of the harbour. The storm-tossed ships we speak about. But those ships were full of storm-tossed men, who week by week and month by month had to endure the continual cold and continual wet, the salt provisions, the endless toil, the boredom and the misery of life in the blockading fleet. Even in the frigates, the eyes and claws of the blockaders, boredom had to be endured. The boredom of long periods with the hatches battened down, with the deck seams above dripping water on the men below, long nights and short days, broken sleep and yet not enough to do. Even in the Indefatigable, there was a feeling of restlessness in the air, and even a mere midshipman like Hornblower could be aware of it as he was looking over the men of his division before the captain's regular weekly inspection. "What's the matter with your face, Styles?" he asked. "Boils, sir. Awful bad." On Styles' cheeks and lips there were half a dozen dabs of sticking plaster. "Have you done anything about them?" "Surgeon's mate, sir. He gave me a plaster for 'em, and he says they'll come right well enough soon, sir." "Very well. Now, was there, or was there not, something strange about the expressions on the faces of the men on either side of Styles? Did they look like men smiling secretly to themselves, laughing up the sleeves? Hornblower did not want to be an object of derision. It was bad for discipline, and it was worse for discipline if the men shared some secret unknown to their officers. He glanced sharply along the line again. Styles was standing like a block of wood, with no expression at all on his swarthy face. The black ringlets over his eyes were properly combed, and no fault could be found with him. But Hornblower sensed that the recent conversation was a source of amusement to the rest of his division, and he did not like it. After divisions, he tackled Mr. Lowe, the surgeon, in the gun-room. "Boils," said Lowe. "Of course the men have boils. Salt pork and split peas for 9 weeks on end. What do you expect but boils? Boils, gurry sores, blains, all the plagues of Egypt. On their faces? Well, that's one locality for boils. You'll find out others from your own personal experience." "Does your mate attend to them?" persisted Hornblower. "Of course. What's he like?" "Mugridge. Is that his name? He's a good surgeon's mate. Get him to compound a black draught for you and you'll see. In fact, I prescribed one for you. You seem in a mighty bad temper, young man." Mr. Lowe finished his glass of rum and pounded on the table for the steward. Hornblower realised that he was lucky to have found Lowe sober enough to give him even this much information, and turned away to go aloft, so as to brood over the question in the solitude of the mizzen-top. This was his new station in action. When the men were not at their quarters, a man might find a little blessed solitude there, something hard to find in the crowded Indefatigable. Bundled up in his pea-jacket, Hornblower sat in the mizzen-top. Over his head the mizzen-topmast drew erratic circles against the grey sky. Beside him, the topmast shrouds sang their high-pitched note in the blustering gale, and below him the life of the ship went on as she rolled and pitched, standing to the northward under close-reefed topsails. At 8 bells she would wear to the southward again on her incessant patrol. Until that time, Hornblower was free to meditate on the boils on Styles' face and the covert grins on the faces of the other men of the division. 2 hands appeared on the stout wooden barricade surrounding the top, and as Hornblower looked up with annoyance at having his meditations interrupted, a head appeared above them. It was Finch, another man in Hornblower's division, who had also had his station in action here in the mizzen-top. He was a frail little man, with wispy hair and pale blue eyes and a foolish smile, which lit up his face when, after betraying some disappointment at finding the mizzen-top already occupied, he recognised Hornblower. "Beg pardon, sir," he said. "I didn't know as how you was up here." Finch was hanging on uncomfortably, back downwards, in the act of transferring himself from the futtock shrouds to the top, and each roll threatened to shake him loose. "Oh, come here if you want to," said Hornblower, cursing himself for his soft-heartedness. A taut officer, he felt, would have told Finch to go back to whence he came and not to bother him. "Thank ye, sir, thank ye," said Finch, bringing his leg over the barricade and allowing the ship's roll to drop him into the top. He crouched forward to peer under the foot of the mizzen topsail forward to the mainmast head, and then turned back to smile disarmingly at Hornblower, like a child caught in moderate mischief. Hornblower knew that Finch was a little weak in the head. The embracing press swept up idiots and landsmen to help man the fleet, although he was a trained seaman who could hand, reef, and steer. That smile betrayed him. "It's better up here than down below, sir," said Finch, apologetically. "You're right," said Hornblower, with a disinterested intonation which would discourage conversation. He turned away to ignore Finch, settled his back again comfortably, and allowed the steady swing of the top to mesmerize him into dreamy thought that might deal with his problem. Yet it was not easy. Finch was as restless almost as a squirrel in a cage, peering forward, changing his position, and so continually breaking in on Hornblower's train of thought, wasting the minutes of his precious half-hour of freedom. "What the devil's the matter with you, Finch?" he rasped at last, patience quite exhausted. "The devil, sir," said Finch. "'Tain't the devil. He's not up here, begging your pardon, sir." The weak, mysterious grin again, like a mischievous child. A great depth of secrets lay in those strange blue eyes. Finch peered under the topsail again. It was a gesture like a baby's playing peekaboo. "There! I saw him that time, sir. God's come back to the maintop, sir." "God?" "Aye, indeed, sir. Sometimes he's in the maintop. More often than not, sir, I saw him that time, with his beard all a-blowing in the wind. It's only from here that you can see him, sir." What could be said to a man with that sort of delusion? Hornblower racked his brains for an answer and found none. Finch seemed to have forgotten his presence, and was playing peekaboo again under the foot of the mizzen topsail. "There he is," said Finch to himself. "There he is again. God's in the maintop and divil's in the cable tier." "Very appropriate," said Hornblower cynically, but to himself. He had no thought of laughing at Finch's delusions. "The devil's in the cable tier during the dog watches," said Finch again to no one at all. "God stays in the maintop forever." "A curious timetable," was Hornblower's sotto voce comment. From down on the deck below came the first strokes of 8 bells, and at the same moment the pipes of the boatswain's mates began to twitter, and the bellow of Waldron, the boatswain, made itself heard. "Turn out watch below, all hands wear ship, all hands, all hands! You, master-at-arms, take the name of the last man up the hatchway, all hands!" The interval of peace, short as it was, and broken by Finch's disturbing presence, was at an end. Hornblower dived over the barricade and gripped the futtock shrouds. Not for him was the easy descent through the lubber's hole, not when the first lieutenant might see him and reprimand him for unseamanlike behaviour. Finch waited for him to quit the top, but even with this length start, Hornblower was easily outpaced in the descent to the deck, for Finch, like the skilled seaman he was, ran down the shrouds as lightly as a monkey. Then the thought of Finch's curious illusions was temporarily submerged in the business of laying the ship on her new course. But later in the day, Hornblower's mind reverted inevitably to the odd things Finch had been saying. There could be no doubt that Finch firmly believed in what he saw. Both his words and his expression made it certain. He had spoken about God's beard. It was a pity that he had not spared a few words to describe the devil in the cable tier. Horns, cloven hoof, and pitchfork? Hornblower wondered. And why was the devil only loose in the cable tier during the dog watches? Strange that he should keep such a timetable. Hornblower caught his breath as the sudden thought came to him that perhaps there might be some worldly explanation. The devil might well be loose in the cable tier in a metaphorical fashion during the dog watches. Devil's work might be going on in there. Hornblower had to decide on what was his duty, and he had to decide further on what was expedient. He could report his suspicions to Eccles, the first lieutenant, but after a year of service, Hornblower was under no illusions about what might happen to a junior midshipman who worried a first lieutenant with unfounded suspicions. It would be better to see for himself first, as far as that went. But he did not know what he would find, if he should find anything at all, and he did not know how he should deal with it if he found anything at all. Much worse than that, he did not know if he would be able to deal with it in an officer-like fashion. He could make a fool of himself. He might mishandle whatever situation he found, and bring down obloquy and derision upon his head, and he might imperil the discipline of the ship. weaken the slender thread of allegiance that bound officers and men together, the discipline which kept 300 men at the bidding of their captain, suffering untold hardship without demur, which made them ready to face death at the word of command. When 8 bells tolled the end of the afternoon watch, and the beginning of the first dog watch, it was with trepidation that Hornblower went below to put a candle in a lantern, and made his way forward to the cable tier. It was dark down here, stuffy, odorous, and as the ship heaved and rolled, he found himself stumbling over the various obstacles that impeded his progress. Yet forward there was a faint light, a murmur of voices. Hornblower choked down his fear that perhaps mutiny was being planned. He put his hand over the horn window of the lantern, so as to obscure its light, and crept forward. 2 lanterns swung from the low deck beams, and crouching under them were a score or more of men, more than that even, and the buzz of their talk came loudly but indistinguishably to Hornblower's ears. Then the buzz increased to a roar, and someone in the centre of the circle rose suddenly as to near full height as the deck beams allowed. He was shaking himself violently from side to side for no apparent reason. His face was away from Hornblower, who saw with a gasp that his hands were tied behind him. The men roared again, like spectators at a prize fight, and the man with his hands tied swung round so that Hornblower could see his face. It was Styles, the man who had suffered from boils. Hornblower knew him at once. But that was not what made the most impression on Hornblower. Clinging to the man's face, weird in the shifting, meagre light, was a grey, writhing shape, and it was to shake this off that Styles was flinging himself about so violently. It was a rat. Hornblower's stomach turned over with horror. With a wild jerk of his head, Styles broke the grip of the rat's teeth and flung the creature down, and then instantly plunged down on his knees with his hands still bound behind him to pursue it with his own teeth. "Time!" roared a voice at that moment. The voice of Partridge, boatswain's mate. Hornblower had been roused by it often enough to recognise it at once. "5 dead," said another voice. "Pay all bets of even a better." Hornblower plunged forward. Part of the cable had been coiled down to make a rat pit, 10 feet across, in which knelt Styles with dead and living rats about his knees. Partridge squatted beside the ring with a sandglass, used for timing the casting of the log, in front of him. "6 dead," protested someone. "That un's dead." "No, he ain't. His back's broken. He's a dead un." "He ain't a dead un," said Partridge. The man who had protested looked up at that moment and caught sight of Hornblower, and his words died away unspoken. At his silence the others followed his glance and stiffened into rigidity, and Hornblower stepped forward. He was still wondering what he should do. He was still fighting down the nausea excited by the horrible things he had seen. Desperately, he mastered his horror, and thinking fast, he took his stand on discipline. "Who's in charge here?" he demanded. He ran his eye round the circle. Petty officers and second-class warrant officers mainly. Boatswain's mates, carpenter's mates, Mugridge, the surgeon's mate. His presence explained much. But his own position was not easy. A midshipman of scant service depended for his authority on board largely on the force of his own personality. He was only a warrant officer himself. When all was said and done, a midshipman was not nearly as important to the ship's economy, and was far more easily replaced than, say, Washburn, the cooper's mate over there, who knew all about the making and storage of the ship's water barrels. "Who's in charge here?" he demanded again, and once more received no direct reply. "We ain't on watch," said a voice in the background. Hornblower by now had mastered his horror. His indignation still flared within him, but he could appear outwardly calm. "No, you're not on watch," he said coldly. "You're gambling." Mugridge took up the defence of that. "Gambling, Mr. Hornblower," he said. "That's a very serious charge. Just a gentlemanly competition. You'll find it hard to substantiate any charges of gambling." Mugridge had been drinking, quite obviously following the example of the head of his department. There was always brandy to be got in the medical stores. A surge of wrath made Hornblower tremble. The effort necessary to keep himself standing stock still was almost too much for him. But the rise in internal pressure brought him inspiration. "Mr. Mugridge," he said icily, "I advise you not to say too much. There are other charges possible, Mr. Mugridge. A member of His Majesty's forces can be charged with rendering himself unfit for service, Mr. Mugridge, and similarly there might be charges of aiding and abetting which might include you. I should consult the Articles of War if I were you, Mr. Mugridge. The punishment for such an offence is flogging round the fleet, I believe." Hornblower pointed to Styles, with the blood streaming from his bitten face, and gave more force to his argument by the gesture. He had met the men's arguments with a more effective one along the same lines. They had taken up a legalistic defence, and he had legalistically beaten it down. He had the upper hand now, and could give vent to his moral indignation. "I could bring charges against every one of you," he roared. "You could be court-martialed, disrated, flogged, every man jack of you. And by God, one more look like that from you, Partridge, and I'll do it. You'd all be in irons in 5 minutes after I spoke to Mr. Eccles. I'll have no more of these filthy games. Let those rats loose there, you Oldroyd, and you, Lewis. Styles, get your face plastered up again. You, Partridge, take these men and coil this cable down properly again before Mr. Waldron sees it. I'll keep my eye on all of you in future. The next hint I have of misbehaviour, and you'll all be at the gratings. I've said it, and by God I mean it." Hornblower was surprised both at his own volubility and at his self-possession. He had not known himself capable of carrying off matters with such a high hand. He sought about in his mind for a final salvo with which to make his retirement dignified, and it came to him as he turned away so that he turned back to deliver it. "After this, I want to see you in the dog watches, skylarking on deck, not skulking in the cable tiers like a lot of Frenchmen." That was the sort of speech to be expected of a pompous old captain, not a junior midshipman, but it served to give dignity to his retirement. There was a feverish buzz of voices as he left the group. Hornblower went up on deck, under the cheerless grey sky, dark with the premature night, to walk the decks to keep himself warm, while the Indefatigable slashed her way to windward, in the teeth of a roaring westerly, the spray flying in sheets over her bows, the straining seams leaking, and her fabric groaning. The end of a day like all the preceding ones, and the predecessor probably of innumerable more. Yet the days passed, and with them came at last a break in the monotony. In the sombre dawn, a hoarse bellow from the lookout turned every eye to windward, to where a dull blotch on the horizon marked the presence of a ship. The watch came running to the braces as the Indefatigable was laid as close to the wind as she would lie. Captain Pellew came on deck with a pea-jacket over his nightshirt, his wigless head comical in a pink nightcap. He trained his glass on the strange sail. A dozen glasses were pointing in that direction. Hornblower, looking through the glass reserved for the junior officer of the watch, saw the grey rectangle split into 3, and saw the 3 grow narrow, and then broaden again to coalesce into a single rectangle again. "She's gone about," said Pellew. "Hands bout ship!" Round came the Indefatigable on the other tack. The watch raced aloft to shake out a reef from the topsails, while on the deck the officers looked up at the straining canvas to calculate the chances of the gale, which howled round their ears, splitting the sails or carrying away a spar. The Indefatigable lay over until it was hard to keep one's footing on the streaming deck. Everyone without immediate duties clung to the weather rail and peered at the other ship. "Fore and main topmasts exactly equal," said Lieutenant Bolton to Hornblower, his telescope to his eye. "Topsails white as milady's fingers. She's a Frenchie, all right." The sails of British ships were darkened with long service in all weathers. When a French ship escaped from harbour to run the blockade, her spotless unweathered canvas disclosed her nationality without real need to take into consideration less obvious technical characteristics. "We're weathering on her," said Hornblower. His eye was aching with straining through the glass, and his arms were weary even holding the telescope to his eye, but in the excitement of the chase he could not relax. "Not as much as I'd like," growled Bolton. "Hands to main brace!" roared Pellew at that moment. It was a moment of the most vital concern to trim the sails, so as to lie as close as possible to the wind. 100 yards gained to windward would count as much as a mile gained in a stern chase. Pellew was looking up at the sails, back at the fleeting wake, across at a French ship, gauging the strength of the wind, estimating the strain on the rigging, doing everything that a lifetime of experience could suggest to close the gap between the two ships. Pellew's next order sent all hands to run out the guns on the weather side. That would in part counteract the heel, and give the Indefatigable more grip on the water. "Now we're walking up to her," said Bolton with grudging optimism. "All hands, beat to quarters!" shouted Pellew. The ship had been expecting that order. The roar of the Marines' bandsmen's drums echoed through the ship. The pipes twittered as the boatswain's mate repeated the order, and the men ran in disciplined fashion to their duties. Hornblower, jumping for the weather mizzen shrouds, saw the eager grins on half a dozen faces. Battle and the imminent possibility of death were a welcome change from the eternal monotony of the blockade. Up in the mizzen top, he looked over his men. They were uncovering the locks of their muskets and looking to the priming. Satisfied with their readiness for action, Hornblower turned his attention to the swivel gun. He took the tarpaulin from the breech and the tompignon from the muzzle, cast off the lashings which secured it, and saw that the swivel moved freely in the socket, and that the trunnions freely in the crotch. A jerk of the lanyard showed him that the lock was sparking well, and there was no need for a new flint. Finch came clambering into the top with the canvas belt over his shoulder, containing the charges for the gun. The bags of musket balls lay handily in a garland fixed to the barricade. Finch rammed home a cartridge down the short muzzle. Hornblower had ready a bag of balls to ram down onto it. Then he took a priming quill and forced it down the touch-hole, feeling sensitively to make sure the sharp point pierced the thin serge bag of the cartridge. Priming quill and flintlock were necessary up here in the top, where no slow match or port fire could be used without the danger of a fire so great, and where the fire would be difficult to control in the sails and the rigging. Yet musketry and swivel gun fire from the tops were an important tactical consideration. When the ships lay to yard arm, Hornblower's men could clear the hostile quarterdeck where centred the brains and control of the enemy ship. "Stop that, Finch," said Hornblower irritably, turning as he had caught sight of him peering up at the mainmast, and at that moment of tension Finch's delusions annoyed him. "Beg your pardon, sir," said Finch, resuming his duties. But a moment later Hornblower heard Finch whisper to himself. "Mr. Bracegirdle's there," whispered Finch, "and Oldroyd's there, and all those others. But he's there too, so he is." "Hands, wear ship!" came the shouted order from the deck below. The old Indefatigable was spinning round on her heel, the yards groaning as the braces swung them round. The French ship had made a bold attempt to rake her enemy as she clawed up to her, but Pellew's prompt handling defeated the plan. Now the ships were broadside to broadside, running free before the wind at a long cannon shot. "Just look at him!" roared Douglas, one of the musketmen in the top. 20 guns aside, looks brave enough, doesn't he?" Standing beside Douglas, Hornblower could look down on the Frenchman's deck. Her guns run out, with the gun crew clustering round them, officers in white breeches and blue coats walking up and down, the spray flying from her bows as she drove headlong before the wind. "She'll look braver still when we take her into Plymouth Sound," said the seaman on the far side of Hornblower. The Indefatigable was slightly the faster ship. An occasional touch of starboard helm was working her in closer to the enemy, into decisive range, without allowing the Frenchman to head-reach upon her. Hornblower was impressed by the silence on both sides. He has always understood that the French were likely to open fire at long range, and to squander ineffectively the carefully loaded first broadside. "When's he going to fire?" asked Douglas, echoing Hornblower's thoughts. "In his good time," piped Finch. The gap of tossing water between the two ships was growing narrower. Hornblower swung the swivel gun round and looked along the sights. He could aim well enough at the Frenchman's quarterdeck, but it was too much a long range for a bag of musket balls. In any case, he dare not open fire until Pellew gave him permission. "Them's the men for us," said Douglas, pointing to the Frenchman's mizzen top. It looked as if there were soldiers up there, judging by the blue uniforms and the crossbelts. The French often eked out their scanty crews of trained seamen by shipping in soldiers. In the British Navy, the Royal Marines were never employed aloft. The French soldiers saw the gesture and shook their fists, and a young officer among them drew his sword and brandished it over his head. With the ships parallel to each other like this, the French mizzen top would be Hornblower's particular objective, should he decide on trying to silence the firing there instead of sweeping the quarterdeck. He gazed curiously at the men that it was his duty to kill. So interested was he that the bang of a cannon took him by surprise. Before he could look down, the rest of the Frenchman's broadside had gone off in struggling fashion, and a moment later the Indefatigable lurched as all her guns went off together. The wind blew the smoke forward, so that in the mizzen top they were not troubled by it at all. Hornblower's glance showed him dead men flung about on the Indefatigable's deck, dead men falling on the Frenchman's deck, and yet still the range was too great. Very long musket shot, his eye told him. "They're shooting at us, sir." "Let 'em," said Hornblower. No musket fired from a heaving masthead at that range could possibly score a hit. That much was obvious. So obvious that even Hornblower, madly excited as he was, could not help be aware of it, and his certainty was apparent in his tone. It was interesting to see how the two calm words steadied the men. Down below, the guns were roaring away continuously, and the ships were nearing each other fast. "Open fire now, men," said Hornblower. "Finch!" He stared down the short length of the swivel gun. In the coarse V of the notch on the muzzle, he could see the Frenchman's wheel, the two quartermasters standing behind it, and the two officers beside it. He jerked the lanyard, a tenth of a second's delay, and then the gun roared out. He was conscious before the smoke whirled round him, the firing quill, blown from the touch-hole, flying past his temple. Finch was already sponging out the gun. The musket balls must have spread badly. Only one of the helmsmen was down, and someone else was already running to take his place. At that moment, the whole top lurched frightfully. Hornblower felt it, but he could not explain it. There was too much happening at once. The solid timbers under his feet jarred him as he stood. Perhaps a shot had hit the mizzenmast. Finch was ramming in the cartridge. Something struck the breech of the gun, a heavy blow, and left a bright splash of metal there. A musket bullet from the Frenchman's mizzen-top. Hornblower tried to keep his head. He took out another sharpened quill and coaxed it down into the touch-hole. It had to be done purposefully, and yet gently. A quill broken off in the touch-hole was likely to be a maddening nuisance. He felt the point of the quill pierce the cartridge. Finch rammed home the wad on top of the musket balls. A bullet struck the barricade beside him as Hornblower trained the gun down, but he gave it no thought. Surely the top was swaying more even than the heavy sea justified. No matter. He had a clear shot at the enemy's quarterdeck. He tugged at the lanyard. He saw men fall. He actually saw the spokes of the wheel spin round as it was left unattended. And then the two ships came together with a shattering crash, and his world dissolved into chaos compared with which what had gone before was orderly. The mast was falling. The top swung round in a dizzy arc, so that only his fortunate grip on the swivel saved him from being flung out like a stone from a sling. It wheeled round. With the shrouds on one side shot away, and two cannonballs in its heart, the mast tottered and rolled. Then the tug of the mizzenstays inclined it forward. The tug of the other shrouds inclined it to starboard, and then the wind in the mizzen topsail took charge when the back stays parted. The mast crashed forward. The topmast caught against the mainyard, and the whole structure hung there before it could dissolve into its constituent parts. The severed butt end of the mast must be resting on the deck for the moment. Mast and topmast were still united at the cap, and the trestle trees into one continuous length, although why the topmast had not snapped at the cap was hard to say. With the lower end of the mast resting precariously on the deck, and the topmast resting against the mainyard, Hornblower and Finch still had a chance of life, but the ship's motion, another shot from the Frenchman, or a parting of the overstrained material could all end that chance. The mast could slip outwards, the topmast could break, the butt end of the mast could slip along the deck. They had to save themselves if they could before any of these imminent events occurred. The main topmast and everything above it was involved in the general ruin. It too had fallen and was dangling, sails, spars, and ropes in one frightful tangle. The mizzen topsail had torn itself free. Hornblower's eyes met Finch's. Finch and he were clinging to the swivel gun, and there was no one else in the steeply inclined top. The starboard side mizzen topmast shroud still survived. They, as well as the topmast, were resting across the mainyard, strained taut as fiddle strings, the mainyard tightening them just as the bridge tightens the strings of a fiddle. But along those shrouds lay the only way to safety, a sloping path from the peril of the top to the comparative safety of the mainyard. The mast began to slip, to roll, out towards the end of the yard. Even if the mainyard held, the mizzenmast would soon fall into the sea alongside. All about them were thunderous noises, spars smashing, ropes parting, the guns were still bellowing, and everyone below seemed to be yelling and screaming. The top lurched again, frightfully. Two of the shrouds parted with the strain, with a noise clearly audible through the other din, and as they parted, the mast twisted with a jerk, swinging further round the mizzen top, the swivel gun, and the two wretched beings who clung to it. Finch's staring blue eyes rolled with the movement of the top. Later, Hornblower knew that the whole period of the fall of the mast was no longer than a few seconds, but at this time it seemed as if he had been at least long minutes in which to think. Like Finch's, his eyes stared round him, and saw the chance to safety, "The mainyard!" he screamed. Finch's face bore its foolish smile. Although instinct or training kept him gripping the swivel gun, he seemingly had no fear, no desire to gain the safety of the mainyard. "Finch, you fool!" yelled Hornblower. He locked a desperate knee round the swivel so as to free a hand with which to gesticulate, but still Finch made no move. "Jump, damn you!" raved Hornblower. "The shrouds, the yard, jump!" Finch only smiled. "Jump and get to the maintop! Oh, Christ!" Inspiration came in that frightful moment. "The maintop! God's there, Finch! Go along to God! Quick!" Those words penetrated into Finch's addled brain. He nodded with sublime unworldliness. Then he let go of the swivel and seemed to launch himself into the air like a frog. His body fell across the main mizzen topmast shrouds, and he began to scramble along them. The mast rolled again, so that when Hornblower launched himself at the shrouds, it was a longer jump. Only his shoulders reached the outermost shroud. He swung off, clung, nearly lost his grip, but regained it as a counterlurch of the leaning mast came to his assistance. Then he was scrambling along the shrouds, mad with panic. Here was the precious mainyard, and he threw himself across it, grappling its welcome, its solidity. With his body, his feet falling, feeling for the foot-rope. He was safe and steady on the yard, just as the outward roll of the Indefatigable gave the balancing spars their final impetus, and the mizzen topmast parted company from the broken mizzenmast, and the whole wreck fell down into the sea alongside. Hornblower shuffled along the yard, whither Finch had preceded him, to be received with rapture in the maintop by Midshipman Bracegirdle. Bracegirdle was not God, but as Hornblower leaned across the breastwork of the maintop, he thought to himself that if he had not spoken about God being in the maintop, Finch would never have made the leap. "We thought we'd lost you," said Bracegirdle, helping him in and thumping him on the back. "Midshipman Hornblower, our flying angel." Finch was in the top too, smiling his fool smile, and surrounded by the crew of the top. Everything seemed mad and exhilarating. It was a shock to remember that they were still in the midst of a battle, and yet the firing had ceased, and even the yelling had almost died away. He staggered to the side of the top. Strange how difficult it was to walk, and looked over. Bracegirdle came with him. Foreshortened by the height, he could make out a crowd of figures on the Frenchman's deck. Those check shirts must surely be worn by British sailors. Surely that was Eccles, the Indefatigable's first lieutenant on the quarterdeck with a speaking trumpet. "What has happened?" he asked Bracegirdle, bewildered. "What has happened?" Bracegirdle stared at a moment before he understood. "We carried her by boarding. Eccles and the boarders were over the ship's side the moment we touched. Why, man, didn't you see?" "No, I didn't see," said Hornblower. He forced himself to joke. "Other matters demanded my attention at that particular moment." He remembered how the mizzen top had lurched and swung, and he felt suddenly sick, but he did not want Bracegirdle to see it. "I must go on deck and report," he said. The descent of the main shrouds was a slow, ticklish business, for neither his hands nor his feet seemed to wish to go where he had tried to place them. Even when he reached the deck, he still felt insecure. Bolton was on the quarterdeck, supervising the clearing away of the wreck of the mizzenmast. He gave a start of surprise as Hornblower approached. "I thought you were overside with Davy Jones," he said. He glanced aloft. "You reached the mainyard in time?" "Yes, sir." "Excellent. I think you were born to be hanged, Mr. Hornblower." Bolton turned away to bellow at the men. "Fast even there! Clines, get down into the chains with that tackle! Steady now, or you'll lose it!" He watched the labours of the men for some moments before he turned back to Hornblower. "No more trouble with the men for a couple of months," he said. "We'll work 'em till they drop. Refitting. Prize crew will leave us short-handed, to say nothing of a butcher's bill. It'll be a long time before they fancy something new. It'll be a long time, I fancy, for you, Mr. Hornblower." "Yes, sir," said Hornblower.